so I can see my slides. So today I'm going to be talking about, this is a kind of CPD update on why carbohydrate quality matters. I've put that image on the right there, which is a rabbit going down a wrong hole. And it's kind of Easter themed, but also because I myself was confused about carbohydrates a few years ago, and I definitely went down a wrong rabbit hole. And I've learned a lot, and I guess that's what I'm going to talk to you today about, why carbohydrate quality really matters. So I'm going to talk about what are carbohydrates, what do they do, the effects of how we process carbohydrates, what does the evidence tell us, carbohydrate quality, how we can define carbohydrate quality, looking beyond the flat glucose line and why that's so important, and then hopefully some practical takeaways to nudge people in the right direction. So firstly, what are carbohydrates? Well, they're a macronutrient in the diet, along with fat and protein. They're molecules that are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they have very different structures depending on the different types that you get. So you can get simple carbohydrates, which are made up of one or two units. They tend to be glucose, fructose, galactose, anything ending in tose, maltose, lactose, sucrose, which is table sugar. And then complex carbohydrates, which are made up of many sugar units, and you can get several different types of these. So you can get starches, including starches which resist in intestinal digestion, known as resistant starches. You can get fibers, which are more complex, and that's this structure on the bottom there, which has is much more complex than these other types of carbohydrates. And then you also get glycogen, which is a form of carbohydrate which we store in our bodies, in our organs, such as our liver, but also in our muscle as well, acting a bit like a sink for energy storage, so that it can kick out glucose when we need it. What do carbohydrates do? Well, they're broken down into glucose, and they have a number of key functions. One is that they serve as a really important fuel to provide us with energy. So, for example, supporting cell and muscle function, our skeletal muscles requiring a huge amount of energy. But also they're a primary source of fuel for our brain. And although our brain, is very lightweight, it actually uses a significant amount of energy. But they're also a really important source of energy for the microbes that live within our gut. So, and not only do opportunistic bacteria thrive off carbohydrates, but other beneficial microbes particularly love the fiber type of carbohydrate, which helps to make those really important metabolites. Where do we find carbohydrates? Well, in nature, they are naturally present in whole plant foods. So they're present in whole grains, in pulses, beans, peas, lentils, vegetables, including potatoes as well, and fruit, as well as nuts and seeds and herbs and spices. However, the vast majority of carbohydrates which we consume in this country, and you'll see there's a myriad of different types of carbohydrate on that image there, the vast majority that we consume are consumed as very processed or ultra processed carbohydrates.
Click on that one.
Sorry, what was that?
Do you want to take this? I've had enough.
Oh.
I'll eat it. You won't like it. You can take the
I'm just going to mute somebody.
Syrup off. Yeah.
hopefully you can all see that okay. Yeah, so the vast majority we consume are ultra-processed versions. Now, fiber is a type of carbohydrate, but it is a unique type of carbohydrate. So it's exclusively found in whole grains, pulses, vegetables, fruit, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. And it's a unique type of carbohydrate because as humans, we lack the digestive enzymes to break down fiber. And in minimally processed plant foods, the fiber is wrapped around the natural sugars and starches which are in that food. And therefore, in its minimally processed form, it acts a bit like a shield or a protective package, which helps to slow digestion of the sugars and starches within that food. But importantly, it then helps to deliver a package of nutrients to the end of our gut to feed these beneficial bacteria, which can break down fiber. So they do have the enzymes to break it down. And they make really important molecules which help to keep us healthy. And that image there really just shows how a whole orange can be digested and therefore metabolized very differently from, say, a highly processed fruit juice, where actually that fiber in its whole form, in the fiber that's in that fruit, wraps around those sugars and starches and then makes its way to the end of our gut. I think most of you were on the call for the slide I had earlier, which is just a recap of this. And it's just to say that fiber is just not just for constipation. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but fiber helps to trigger appetite regulatory hormones like GLP-1 and hunger hormones like ghrelin, which stimulate appetite. It also has a role to play in regulating our blood glucose levels, controlling how much insulin we produce, but also how sensitive that insulin is. It also helps to maintain our gut barrier, and having a healthy gut barrier is really important for controlling what comes in and out of our body. And fiber is the major fuel to maintain that healthy gut barrier. And a breakdown in that gut barrier is now linked with so many of the chronic conditions we see. And it helps to control inflammation, again, which is now being linked. Chronic inflammation is now linked with so many of these conditions which plague our society: Alzheimer's, cancers, diabetes, just to name a few. And then also responsible for building that strong and regulated immune system. And this is where that diversity in our diet also seems to be really important. Actually, different plant foods provide different fibers, which feed different bacteria, which help to switch on and off our immune system to make sure that it's regulated and not overreacting or harming our own body cells. And then regulation of our mood. So many hormones and neurotransmitters are produced and modulated via our gut microbiome. And as I mentioned earlier, we're a bit like a tube, and actually we feed these bacteria, and in return, they do all these incredibly amazing functions which help to keep us healthy. So I put an image of the potato here. And that's because the potato often gets a lot of bad press, and we tend to group all carbohydrates really unhelpfully together. And actually, we've been eating potatoes for many years, and we were doing pretty well until we started to ultra process our potatoes. This image on the right is just a microscopic image of a close-up view of a potato. And you will see the green globules are the starches, the natural starches present within this potato. And they're wrapped around this lovely, amazing honeycomb matrix, which is the fiber. And remember what I said, fiber's indigestible. So we cannot break it down, and we will cook our potatoes, and we will, of course, chew our potatoes. And some of those starches will be released. But also some of them will remain intact and make their way to our gut microbiome. And the more we break down our food structure, we lose fiber. We often take it out completely. We lose the healthier fats because they become exposed to oxygen, and we tend to add in other fats instead. We often lose a lot of the protein. We lose phytonutrients, which are these really important plant nutrients, which also interact with our gut microbiome. And the more we process our foods, the more those sugars and starches are digested more rapidly, enabling bacteria who once upon a time would never have been fed so well, meaning that opportunistic bacteria then get to thrive. The more we process our foods, the less favorable our blood glucose response. And the next slide talks about that in more detail. But also the more we process our foods, the more we add in added extras. And predominantly, well, about 60% of our UK diet is made up of ultra processed foods. So when we look at the Western diet, our background diet is really important because it shapes our gut microbiome. The Western background diet is high in accessible sugars and starches. Accessible meaning they have been removed from their plant structure. And this means that this diet high in accessible sugars and starches, which invariably is low in fiber, very low in fiber, shifts our microbiome composition, meaning that opportunistic bacteria get to thrive and increase in numbers. And because they're good at metabolizing sugars and starches very rapidly, the more we have of them, the better we get at taking up glucose into our bloodstream, but also making dental caries. When we harbor bacteria, unhelpful bacteria in our mouths, they break down these accessible sugars and starches, and actually a byproduct of this is an acid, and that is the thing that burns the holes in our teeth. And actually, there's now research looking at the oral microbiome and how this change in the oral microbiome increases our risk of diseases, particularly Alzheimer's is one they're looking at the moment. But more importantly, the more our diet is processed, the more we starve these beneficial bacteria that live at the end of our gut, that play a really important role in maintaining our gut barrier, but also producing the metabolites, which then help to regulate our blood glucose levels and insulin levels. And it's this shift to a pro-inflammatory state which appears so detrimental and correlates with so many of these diseases. So carbohydrate, what does the evidence tell us? Well, it tells us that not all carbs are equal. Historically, and sadly in present day, studies often measured total carbohydrates, grouping them all together. So all carbohydrates got tied together with the same brush. So as an example, and this is just an example, if we take a study looking at people who eat 3 burgers a day, and they're advised to reduce their intake of saturated fat by replacing their burgers with whatever they like. But in this case, they replace their burgers with a large portion of fries and a large cola. The study finds that they have increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So guess what the news headline is? High carb diets, low in saturated fat, increase the risk of CVD. So therefore, eat more burgers for good health. I hope you can see the flaws in this. We must ask ourselves, instead of what are these people replacing these, whenever we look at a study, what is the replacement? Because whenever we take something out, we add something else in. And actually the type of carbohydrates we eat lead to very different health outcomes. And this is where, particularly in the last decade, the research has been looking at, the quality of carbohydrates we eat in more detail. As an example, whole fruit processing. So as with the more we process the food, the whole fruit, the more, and processing that could be mechanical, heat, pressure, storage, sitting on our shelves for a long time as well. It changes how the sugars are digested and metabolized. So those sugars that are in that fruit then become free sugars. They're freed up from their structure. We generally have an increase in total sugars as well, because often, when people buy these juices, you can often get, maybe 5 or 6 oranges in one serving. And actually, if you were to sit there and eat 5 or 6 oranges in one go, you might find that more challenging. And it leads to a reduction in fiber. The more we process our fruit, we reduce the phytonutrients, the more we process it, because they destabilize. And then because we like these things to sit on the shelf for a long time, we then tend to add in additives, and then we get ultra processed versions of these fruits. And this is just, to show you a stepwise, change in how increased processing leads to a loss of nutrient density. And of course, fruits contain carbohydrates, but the evidence tells us that actually the type of fruit we eat has very different health outcomes. I apologize, some of these slides are, there's quite a lot of information on there, but I was just trying to show you comparators. So when we look at whole fruit intake, it's associated with improved appetite regulation, including increased production of gut hormones and regulation of gut hormones. It's associated with improved weight regulation, improved insulin sensitivity. So that means the insulin that we are producing is then able to get into the cells and muscles, enabling that glucose to be taken, away from our bloodstream into our cells, to be used for energy. It's also associated with improved glucose regulation. People who consume more whole fruit actually have better blood glucose control. And higher whole fruit intakes are associated with a reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a reduced risk of gestational diabetes, and a reduced risk of frailty. But on the other hand, when we look at fruit juice is associated with reduced fullness. So actually people not feeling as full for as long as they would if they ate the whole fruit. It's associated with increased hunger soon after, and that's particularly looking at people with overweight and obesity. There are inconsistent effects on glucose and insulin sensitivity when we compare them with sugar-sweetened beverages. And I think this is where, when we look at the evidence, we always need to look at what are we replacing instead. And when we know actually sugar-sweetened beverages, energy drinks offer us absolutely nothing of any nutritional value. And this might be why there are inconsistencies when it comes to fruit juice on the effects of glucose and insulin, whereas some saying actually they're, more favorable compared to sugar-sweetened beverages. And that's probably because at least they may have some small amounts of, soluble fiber. They may have small amounts of, phytonutrients in them. And the higher total fruit juice intake is associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes. But the results are inconsistent compared with when we look at 100% fruit juice. And again, it's coming down to quality. What are we having instead? And this is where actually 100% fruit juice is probably most definitely more favorable than a fruit juice from concentrate, which has been highly processed. But then the whole fruit comes out more favorable again than the fruit juice. I just repeated what I said there. So whole fruit would be the healthier choice. When we look at grains and health, so again, very different outcomes depending on the types of grains that we consume in our diet. So I'll start off with the refined grains. So refined grains are associated. So a refined grain is basically a grain that has been stripped of various nutrients. More often than not, it tends to be fiber that's stripped out, and the white starchy core tends to remain, and then that is then used to make a lot of our foods. And in fact, the vast majority of carbohydrates we consume in the UK diet are made of, white and refined, highly processed carbohydrates. They're associated with increased inflammatory markers, increased risk of all-cause mortality, so death from all causes, increased risk of cardiovascular disease events, The cancer risk is mixed and inconclusive. So there's some evidence showing that actually refined grains increase the risk of certain cancers. I think prostate is one in particular, but they actually show a reduction in total cancers overall. And again, I think this is why when we look at the evidence, when we look at refined grains, and I've just put a few examples there, there's a myriad of different refined grains, and some of them are healthier than others. And I think, if we're having more refined grains in the diet, we might be displacing room for added sugar, which is probably more detrimental. And that could explain why some studies have shown higher intakes of refined grains have shown a slightly risk reduction in cancer. However, whole grains offer a significant risk reduction, and I'll talk about that in a minute. White rice, the evidence is mixed. And again, I think this is where, when we look at studies, they often group refined grains all together. So white rice might be put in with, for example, the glow in the dark crisps there as a refined carbohydrate. And this is where, white rice could be, again, it's what are we replacing it with? But also white rice retains some of that structure, and it does have a little bit of fiber, which could explain why there's some inconsistencies there. However, when we look at whole grains, the evidence tells us actually there are significant, improvements that we see with whole grains. For example, improved appetite regulation, reduced inflammatory markers, and if they're coming down, then that's absolutely a positive thing. They appear protective against fatty liver. Actually, people who consume more whole grains in their diet actually are less likely to develop fatty liver. Reduced fasting blood glucose and risk of type 2 diabetes significantly, around 20%, with some studies showing even higher risk reductions. Reduced risk of hypertension, coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease, and reduced risk of certain cancers and all-cause mortality. But sadly, 95% of our UK population do not eat the recommended whole grain intakes. And I guess thinking about, whole grains and refined grains, when we look at the evidence, I guess it's remembering that there's such variation within even both of these groups, and to think of it as a sliding scale of healthier to, or less healthy to healthier. For example, oats or muesli without added sugar are often grouped with multigrain ultra-processed hoops. So multigrain ultra-processed hoops would come under the whole grain category, even though they're very different to the oats or the muesli. And likewise, refined grains without additives could then be grouped in the refined grain category. So, for example, the pasta there, which would unlikely to have any additives to it, might be grouped with other ultra-processed, noodles and things like that. Which have been, highly ultra processed. And actually the whole grain content can vary widely as well. And I think that's important to remember as well. So for example, as an example, granary bread isn't even made with whole grains. It has a few grain flakes in it, but actually it's predominantly made with white flour. And then some of your supermarket breads often will be made with whole grains, but actually there'll be a real mix. Some of these products can contain as little as 6% whole grains and still have a label saying that they're good for health and a whole grain food. So there's work that needs to be done in how we categorize these foods and how they are advertised. But then an emerging area of research, and actually there are studies going back to the 70s showing that actually intact whole grains offer even greater benefit for reducing our post-meal blood glucose, reducing our glycemic variability, which I'll talk about a bit later, which is related to a reduction in CVD risk, and also improved weight regulation, weight loss, particularly for people with living with overweight and obesity. And actually, UK intakes of these whole intact grains are incredibly low. Just looking at whole grain processing, because this matters. So I'm just going to touch on a study which was done by Aberg and Andrew Reynolds, who's a professor in New Zealand. And this was done a couple of years ago, looking at people living with type 2 diabetes and comparing finely milled whole grains to intact grains with more structure. And this was it was a short randomized controlled trial looking at foods that were made with 100% whole grains and no additives added. And there was a short 2-week crossover. So these people living with diabetes did 2 weeks on one diet and then 2 weeks on another diet. So they did 2 weeks on a finely milled whole grain diet where they had instant oats, they had brown rice pasta, where the brown rice had been ground into a fine grain and then reconstituted into pasta. And then they had whole grain bread. And then they swapped over and they had jumbo oats or traditional oats, which retain more structure. They had brown rice, which retains that structure. And then they had a coarser bread with bits of kibbled wheat in, so bits of intact grain in. And so these different diets that they were on were the same nutrient and fiber content, but structurally they were very different. And actually they found very different responses. So actually when these people were on the finely milled diet, their weight actually increased a bit, but it reached clinical significance. And their BMI, of course, went up a little bit as well. But when they were on the intact grains, they actually reduced weight and BMI. And they had a reduction in blood glucose, particularly remarkable post-breakfast. But also the meals after that continued to improve. And their day-long variability, which is a marker of CVD risk, reduced. So actually the coarser and intact grains appear more favourable for blood glucose and weight regulation and reduced metabolic risk factors. But I think we must remember, instead of what this trial didn't have a white refined carbohydrate arm. And if it had, I have no doubt we would have seen, as complete opposite outcomes. And it's remembering that actually when we look at the evidence, whole grains, whether they are finely milled or not, are still associated with improved health outcomes when we compare them to white and ultra processed grains. Again, when we look at potatoes, so for years in the research, potatoes were often grouped together as potato foods, and total potato intake has been associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes. However, more recently, diet quality studies looking at types of potato show that actually we can have very divergent health outcomes. That lovely potato image that I showed you there. So when it makes its way into many of our processing factories, often it's turned into a refined starch, or it's coated in a refined starch. And then it's used to make so many potato products that are widely consumed for convenience purposes today. But actually the types of potatoes really matter. So for example, French fries are associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, quite a significant increased risk, about 20%. Whereas actually when the evidence looks at other types of potatoes, baked, boiled and mashed, they come out with either a neutral risk or a reduced risk. There was a recent Norwegian study recently showing that actually people who consume more boiled potatoes each day had a significant reduction in cardiovascular disease. But again, I think we need to look at the evidence, and even baked, boiled and mashed, sometimes for example, pre-made oven products would be grouped into that category as well. So I think we just need to bear that in mind when we look at the evidence. How, I wonder if they were separated, would we see even, greater benefits? Replacing potatoes which are baked, boiled, or mashed with whole grains is associated with a risk reduction in type 2 diabetes. But replacing potatoes with white rice is associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And, could that be that because we're, changing, we're reducing the fiber intake? But so different potatoes lead to different outcomes. This is just a recent trial looking at food processing. So when we look at the carbohydrates we eat, we often eat them, highly processed. And this study here was the update study, which you might be familiar with. It was on the news not long ago. It was done by UCL in London. And they took people who were living with overweight and obesity, who had a habitual ultra-processed food intake of more than 50% of their energy a day from ultra-processed foods. And what they did was they had 8-week interventions where these people were given ingredients and foods and instructions and everything to support a minimally processed diet. And then they had an ultra processed diet. And both these diets adhered to the Eat Well Guide recommendations with matched macronutrient profiles. So the energy, protein, carbs, fat, fiber, free sugars, etc., were equivalent. And both diets resulted in weight loss. But I think one thing we need to remember is that actually this was because this was probably because these diets were adhering to the Eat Well Guide recommendations of including more whole grains and having more fruits and vegetables. But actually fewer than 0.1% of people actually follow the Eat Well Guide recommendations. So this is probably why we saw some weight loss in both interventions. However, there was significantly greater weight loss on the minimally processed diet compared to the ultra processed diet, which is what that graph on the right shows you. And other randomized control trials have demonstrated improved regulation of appetite, hormones, and weight with minimally processed diets. So particularly the Kevin Hall study, which we talk about in our training, they're worth a look if anyone wants to have a look at them. So when we're looking at carbohydrates, we mustn't tie them with the same brush because they're so different. When we're looking at high quality carbohydrates, well, what defines high quality? And I've put in here a list of factors which would, suggest a higher quality carbohydrate. One would be the absence of free sugars. So those sugars which have been either added or, freed from their natural structure. An absence of refinement, so that actually they retain those nutrients, they retain beneficial fiber that are naturally present in those foods. High nutrient density, these foods offer us lots of really important nutrients, including phytonutrients, which are exclusively found in plant foods. And they're either unprocessed or minimally processed. And then retention of that natural plant structure, so looking more like its natural state, also suggests a higher quality carbohydrate. They tend to be lower in GI glycemic index and glycemic load, but I put a star there because I think this is where we need to be really careful, where our background diet affects our blood glucose response. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. And actually, glycemic index and glycemic load are actually turning out to be not as helpful as what we thought they were. Low quality carbohydrates. So I've put probably some of the lowest of the low on here, just to give you an idea. But factors which reduce a carbohydrate quality include the presence of free sugars. So having more free sugars, also added sugars, and sugars that have been removed from their natural food structure. Refinement and especially an absence of fiber, and pretty much most of these foods are devoid of any fiber. They offer low nutrient density and they tend to be more processed, and especially the ultra processed versions. And a breakdown of the plant structure, so they become less recognizable and invariably much more packaged than their natural counterparts. They also tend to be higher in glycemic index, glycemic load, but I think it's important to remember that actually some foods like cakes and ice creams will have a low GI, but actually are associated with worse health outcomes. So I think, we really need to bear that in mind, and I'll hopefully elaborate on that a bit more. Diet quality is really important, and I've just picked up a trial here. This was the Diet Fit study, a randomized controlled trial looking at people who were living with who were living with overweight, and they were randomized to either a healthy low carb diet or a healthy low fat diet. So both of these contained better, higher quality carbohydrates within these diets. And what was really interesting is they both lost weight, and a small amount of people actually gained a tiny amount of weight on both of these groups. But it was really interesting to show that actually when the quality of food was emphasized for both these diets, and yet they both saw very similar amounts of weight loss at 12 months. And actually when the professors who led this study looked into it in more detail, they found that actually the diet quality and the adherence to the diet, so whether that people were more likely to sustain it, were the greatest predictors of weight loss for both those diets. And just to show actually, when you look at different diets, and invariably we often so focus on restriction, but this is just an analysis from the American Heart Association, and it just shows how much in common these diets have. When we look at them, they all tend to reduce added sugars, refined grains, and more processed foods. And perhaps this could be the reason why we see short-term weight loss, why we see short-term improvements in energy and short-term, improvements in blood glucose, blood pressure, etc. Probably because people are cutting down on the not so helpful carbs, which are associated with worse health outcomes and help to feed these opportunistic bacteria. But then look at what they all emphasize to some degree. They all have so much in common in the fact that they emphasize more of these whole, minimally processed sources of carbohydrates in their diet. And when we look at dietary patterns and the gut microbiome, so I brought this in. This was a recent analysis of 80 randomized controlled trials looking at the effects of different diets on the gut microbiome. And Mediterranean, Asian, and plant-focused diets were associated with increased abundances of these really helpful short-chain fatty acids, or increases in beneficial bacteria, or reduced abundances of opportunistic bacteria. So lots of benefits there. They were also associated with reduced levels of inflammatory markers, again indicating that if they're coming down, that's definitely a positive. But then restrictive diets, the low FODMAP diet, the gluten-free diet, and the ketogenic diet, these are also associated with some benefits in the gut microbiome, reduced inflammatory markers. And well, I wonder why that might be. Could it be that actually these diets maybe reduce some of the cruddy carbohydrates that we're eating? For example, the low FODMAP diet tends to reduce ultra-processed foods just by its very nature. The gluten-free diet tends to reduce a lot of the white refined stuff, but not always. There's some caveats there. And then the ketogenic diet, well, again, we're cutting out the kind of rubbishy carbs that make up most of our diet. But then when we look at these dietary patterns, these restrictive diets are also associated with a reduction in short-chain fatty acids or beneficial bacteria, which appear really important for our health. And well, surprise, surprise, the Western SAD diet, the standard American diet, which very sadly is the basis of most of our population's diet, is associated with no benefits. So, yeah. And then when we look at how much carbohydrate, So actually moderate intakes appear to offer us the greatest benefits. So for example, it's around this 50 to 55% of our energy intake coming from carbohydrate is associated with the lowest risk. And low carbohydrate diets have been associated with higher risk. Probably is that because we are inevitably lowering our fiber intakes in the long term. But also higher carbohydrates have been associated with higher risks. So that's more than 70% of the diet of energy coming from carbohydrates. But again, I think we need to look at when these studies are done, the very high carbohydrate diets are actually really difficult to achieve, and often they tend to be in very sort of deprived areas of the world which lack protein and fat in their diet. And rather than the carbohydrate being the reason, possibly this could be due to the fact that actually these people don't invariably get enough protein and fat in their diet as a result of that. However, the food source is of greater importance. And actually, carbohydrate quality determines major health outcomes. And I'd encourage anyone to look at this study, the carbohydrate quality in human health. It was a series of systematic reviews and meta-analysis commissioned by the World Health Organization. And it contained more than 135 million person years worth of data. And it showed some really interesting findings. And greater dietary fiber was associated with significantly reduced all-cause mortality and chronic diseases. And what did it included 185 prospective studies and 58 clinical trials. And this reduction was around 15 to 30% decrease in all-cause and cardiovascular related mortality and incidence of coronary heart disease, stroke incidence and mortality, type 2 diabetes, breast and colorectal cancer. And interestingly, there was a very similar effect found with whole grains, showing a dose response effect. And that was basically the more dietary fiber, the more whole grains people had in their diet, the greater the risk reduction in those diseases. And the authors did highlight, though, that actually the foods that were present within these studies were from minimally processed fiber containing foods and not from the fiber extruded products that you get, that make up many of our whole grain products that are consumed today. And so they did say actually the greatest benefit comes from, appears to come from the whole food. And actually, what was interesting was that the markers of glycemic index of a person's diet or glycemic load appeared less useful, and they didn't show the same strong correlation. And could that be because of our background diet? Quality is more important than the total amount, and these guidelines produced by the World Health Organization were updated in 2023. And they highlighted that actually the quality of carbohydrates rather than the quantity determines major health outcomes. And they emphasized that carbs should primarily come from whole grains, pulses, vegetables, and fruits, and that naturally occurring fiber is recommended. And they also add in there that because there is evidence to suggest that the naturally occurring structure of intact whole grains contributes to its observed health benefits, then minimal processing of whole grains beyond that necessary to ensure edibility is preferred. So when we look at carbohydrate restriction, because lots of people, like to restrict the carbohydrates, we know that actually, yes, cutting carbs down in the short term may result in a short-term reduction in HbA1c for some people, not everyone. But what are the long-term effects? Well, actually, we know that in terms of glycemic control and weight loss, low carbohydrates are no better than control diets. And actually, the quality matters. And recent studies have been looking at people who have lower carbohydrate intakes in their diet and have shown that actually the quality really matters. So, for example, if people do want to do these diets, I would really encourage you, if that's what you want to do, please focus on quality, because actually lower quality carbohydrates made of these refined carbohydrates and predominantly animal based are associated with increased risk of mortality, increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and more weight gain long term. Whereas higher quality plant focused low carbohydrate diets, where they're choosing higher quality carbohydrates, are associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, reduced mortality, and less weight gain long term. And this is where any benefits of reducing carbohydrate appear to be related to the quality. But what are the long-term effects of cutting? Inevitably, we are cutting down on our fiber intakes when we do this, and the reduction in short-chain fatty acid production and gut barrier integrity, which are so important for controlling inflammation and helping to produce molecules which regulate our blood glucose in the long term. Well, we want people to look beyond the flat line, because actually the glucose response is multifactorial. It's affected by foods that we eat with, foods that are eaten with that food, and also prior to that meal, what we've eaten before that meal. It's affected by time of day as well, physical activity, and our gut microbiome health as well, which is affected by our background diet, will shape how much glucose we take up into our bloodstream rapidly, or how much will make its way to our gut microbiome and then be used to make those important molecules which help to regulate our blood glucose levels. Stress, high cortisol levels also, will affect our blood glucose levels. Poor sleep will also affect our blood glucose levels. And aging, which is associated with chronic inflammation, low-grade inflammation, and a reduction in diversity in our gut microbiome. And of course, well, we know as we age, our risk of diabetes goes up significantly. But all the above are the response that we get. So when we're eating an apple and if we see a high blood glucose level, that is a reflection of our ability to process that carbohydrate. And actually judging the value of a food by the glucose response can be really misleading. So for example, and I touched on earlier, ice cream, processed and red meats, fructose syrups, they may not raise our plasma glucose, but they are associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And they also activate different metabolic pathways, which appear to contribute to those conditions. And one thing we really tried to get across in our training is that, we don't doubt that infographics like this were made with good intentions, but actually these are really unhelpful. They do not distinguish high quality versus low quality carbohydrates. Our fruits and our vegetables, when we eat them in their minimally processed form, they are wrapped in fiber and phytonutrients. And to say that they behave like cubes of sugar is so misleading. Not only can they lead to the omission of foods which promote long-term health and better blood glucose control, but they may also lead to reduction in our dietary diversity as well. And how we process our carbs is important. As I mentioned earlier, that response is a reflection of our ability to process carbohydrates. So once upon a time, the HbA1c was considered the gold standard, but it doesn't give us a complete picture. It doesn't show us, what's happening in between. It doesn't show us when we're getting big highs or big lows. And we know that that is associated with, a detrimental effect on our, on our blood vessel function. It results in vascular damage and is associated with chronic complications. And actually, these large scale availability of these continuous glucose management systems, or CGMs, is revealing that actually variability really matters. So, for example, the presence of hyper and hypo and the amplitude of fluctuations over a defined period of time is turning out to be really important. So amplitude might be the distance between the peaks and troughs, and then the duration might be the length of time over changes in blood glucose levels before they stabilize. The frequency might be the number of fluctuations in glucose levels over a specified period of time, and then the direction of travel. And then there's the consistency as well between days, like as I mentioned earlier about day-long variability being a marker of cardiovascular disease. And I think there's at least about 20 different ways to measure glycemic variability, and some of them are, can be quite complicated. But greater glycemic variability is actually turning out to be a more reliable predictor of diabetes complications and mortality. So, for example, two people with the same HbA1c can actually have very different risks of mortality and diabetes complications. And that graph there on the right just shows like the variability of hypothetical patients. So you've got the patient A, where they're having big highs and big lows, so big swings in their blood sugar. And then patient B's got a more, gradual up and down. And then patient C has it very low for some days and then it swings very high in others. And actually higher and when we take HbA1c in total as well, higher and lower HbA1c is also associated with poorer outcomes. So this whole drive to get the HbA1c down as low as possible, actually that appears to be, can be detrimental. And we want to, keep it an optimal and dependent on that individual person as well. And I think, what happens when people reintroduce carbs after they go low carb? I just put that as a question mark, because I know it's something, we would see within diabetes, is that often when people went low carb, or ketogenic in particular, they often struggled to sustain it. But when they did introduce carbs in their diet, often their blood glucose levels would be having massive swings, highs and lows. And that appears to be, really important, because actually that appears to significantly increase their risk of cardiovascular disease. And actually, as they introduce those carbs back in, it does start to settle. But I wonder if that's because actually we've taken the fiber out of their diet, and actually, are we just masking the problem? Actually, if these people are struggling to metabolize, the energy they get from their foods, if they're struggling to, control their blood glucose levels, rather than just avoid foods, we should be asking ourselves, why are they having so much trouble, being able to regulate their blood glucose levels? And when we look at diet and carbohydrate quality and glycemic variability, again, there have been studies looking at people with impaired glucose tolerance, and refined grains are associated with higher glycemic variability, whereas whole grains are associated with reduced glycemic variability. So again, really opposing outcomes. In people who don't have diabetes, higher diet and carbohydrate quality scores, so that's having more of these higher quality carbohydrates in their diet, are associated with reduced glycemic variability. And I think just one thing to remember is that actually, when we become so fixated on the blood glucose line and keeping things as flat as possible, actually people living with diabetes, they do not die from their high blood glucose levels. It is predominantly the cardiovascular disease that kills them. And, when we look at dietary patterns, the healthiest populations around the world, for example, the Mediterranean, which isn't just one diet, it was many countries which line the Mediterranean, where researchers picked these themes that were associated with risk reductions. and Asian diets, and Japan was part of that Mediterranean cohort too. But also these blue zones, these populations tend to be quite rural populations, kind of used to be cut off from Western foods, and they would eat a lot of plants in their diet. And the blue zones, sorry, were populations who kind of lived for longer and were healthier and didn't seem to have the chronic diseases that plague us today, but their diets sadly are changing too. But they did all these common diets that we associate with better health. They all included more plants in their diet. They all included more minimally processed foods, and they all included mainly high quality carbohydrates. They weren't having a low carbohydrate diet. They weren't having a low fat diet. I think Japan was the only one that kind of was slightly different on that, where they didn't consume a lot of fat. But they ate very few low quality carbohydrates. They weren't having the pastries, the sugars, the energy drinks. And when we look at the evidence, actually healthier populations and cohorts who consume more high quality carbohydrates from whole grains, pulses, vegetables, fruits, nuts and seeds have reduced risk of mortality and non-communicable diseases, including type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia and cancers. And just a few fact checks before I wrap up, is that actually our population are not getting sick from eating too many fruits and vegetables. The sad reality is only 16% of adults achieve 5 portions of fruit and veg each day, and that figure very sadly is even lower for children. It's 9%. 2 years ago, that figure was 17% for children. It then dropped to 12%, and it's now 9%. Only 4% of adults in the UK meet the minimum 30 grams of fibre recommendation each day. So that's 96% of people are not getting enough fibre. And very sadly, more than 95% exceed maximum added sugar intakes. And that graph on the right is a graph from the Global Burden of Disease study, which were deaths attributable to individual dietary risks at a global level. And I've highlighted that actually diets low in whole grains are up there, as well as diets low in fruit, low in nuts and seeds, low in vegetables, low in omega-3 fatty acids, low in fiber, and low in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and also low in pulses. And I think that just really emphasizes, kind of correlates with what we're about, is why we are focusing on more, because actually if we can nudge our population towards higher quality carbohydrates, then they're headed in the right direction. We were all about keeping it real, relatable and easy, because for anyone who was on the population health talk we had last week, we had Dr. Leslie Lewis come and talk to us, and she was talking about how, to support behaviour changes, things need to be easy, things need to be within reach for people, they need to be doable, and which is why we're all about nudging people to be healthier, instead of healthy, which we know is so far away for so many people. And we're about making small easy steps which also allow time for our gut microbiome to adjust, minimizing our gut symptoms, but also time for our taste buds to adapt as well, because there is some interesting studies looking at, particularly in animal models, which show that actually the bacteria that predominate in the gut may be driving our cravings for, highly sweet, salty and refined foods. But also making small steps means we can build confidence and skills in, making foods, starting to, make our own foods from scratch and relying less on ultra-processed foods. And also noticing those health gains. We're looking beyond weight alone, because actually we feel if people start to link the two together and realize that actually maybe they've got more energy, maybe they've got better skin, better sleep, that actually that reinforces those changes. So there's just some examples there on the right, moving from the energy drink to the whole fruit, moving from the glow in the dark crisps to ones that don't glow in the dark, to then nudging towards, the salted peanuts, and maybe then they might find them too salty and they might then mix in some unsalted nuts. And then, moving from the ultra processed carbohydrates, the pot noodle, onto the white pasta. That is a step healthier, less additives in it. And then we can look at what we add to that pasta to make it healthier. Eventually, for the same price, people might pick up the whole grain pasta, realizing that actually that fiber in it is really important. And then eventually we might get some people experimenting with some of those intact grains, which appear to offer even greater health benefits. And then small steps, if we can nudge people from the spaghetti hoops to the baked beans, that's got to be a win. At least we're getting some fiber in them. Yes, it's got, several teaspoons of sugar in it, but eventually as their taste buds adapt with time, we might then be able to dilute those beans with some beans that don't have added sugar, maybe thinking about adding in the herbs and spices, which is such an easy win. And so to summarize, I hope that's given you an overview on why carbohydrate quality really matters, and actually focusing on carb quality rather than quantity offers us the most robust evidence for benefit. Glycemic index and glycemic load actually appear to be less helpful. And again, this is probably because, they're affected by our background diet, and also other foods like fat and protein. And I think if I give an example of myself, a couple of years ago, I was definitely on the trajectory for diabetes, and I started to include. I started with the steel cut oats, I remember. And I remember my blood sugar was actually quite high, but something was telling me actually no, these actually they come out beneficial in the evidence. And the more I included of these and other minimally processed foods and pulses, the more I noticed my blood glucose control improve. And had I looked at that and avoided that food because my blood sugar was all over the place, I have no doubt I would have ended up in a worse, far worse scenario. And I've seen lots of benefits. But the benefits of fiber go beyond the glycemic control. That's just a symptom. And actually a focus on dietary patterns rather than single nutrients offers us greater flexibility and choice. And I think, adherence is really important. Adherence, as that picture on the right says, the best diet is actually the one you can sustain the longest. And it's an important predictor of long-term benefit. So I'll leave you with that image. I'll stop recording a minute.